Coming up next on C-SPAN 2, we will take you to the National Press Club for live coverage of a luncheon address by author Gore Vidal. Mr. Vidal has written a number of novels and plays, including Myra Breckinridge, Burr, and Lincoln, which look at American history and life. Coming up next, you will see his remarks in a speech called State of the Union. We now take you to the National Press Club for Gore Vidal.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Catherine Kaler. I'm a reporter for Newhouse Newspapers, and I'm president of the Press Club. I'd like to welcome my fellow club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you who are listening to this program over one of the more than 400 national public radio stations or watching on one of the 3,600 cable systems affiliated with C-SPAN. Before introducing the guests at our head table, I'd like to remind our members of some coming events. On December 12th, Jay Leno will be here, and on December 13th, Ambassador Robert Strauss. And on December 16th, His Excellency Anand Panayarachun, the Prime Minister of Thailand, will join us. Audio and videotapes of today's luncheon are available through the National Press Club Library or by calling 1-800-952-TAPE. I'd also like to remind our guests that if you have any questions for our speaker today, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I'll ask as many as time permits. And now I'd like to introduce the guests at our head table. I'd ask them to stand briefly when their names are read, and I'd ask the audience to withhold any applause until I've read all the names. Finley Lewis of Copley News Service, Susan Stamberg, National Public Radio, Robert Harris of Knight Ridder Newspapers, Bob Mary, Congressional Quarterly, Dick Ryan of the Detroit News, Wilcom Washburn, Director of the American Studies Program of the Smithsonian Institution, Gil Klein, Media General News Service and a member of the NPC Board of Governors, E. Barrett Prettyman, attorney and member, Penn Faulkner, Sandra McElwain, Cosmopolitan Magazine, and the member of our Speakers Committee who organized today's luncheon, Bob Garfield of Advertising Age, Carolyn Patterson, freelance, and Wayne Biddle, author and journalist. Our guest speaker today is an author, playwright, satirist, and talk show super guest, Gore Vidal. He is one of the best-known American writers of his time, not only for his work, but for the sheer force of his personality. Two of the words most frequently used to describe him are controversial and outrageous. The one thing Gore Vidal is not is boring. Rolling Stone once described him as ever witty, always cheerless, alternately obstreperous, and charming. Mr. Vidal's family background is notably patrician, yet he rails against the bank, his term for those he considers America's ruling class. He has been accused of hating his country, yet he dreams of becoming president. He has already run, albeit unsuccessfully, for the House and the Senate. Eugene Luther Vidal has never been far from politics. Most of his childhood was spent in Washington, where his blind grandfather, the late Senator Thomas Pryor Gore of Oklahoma, was a great influence on him. Mr. Vidal spent hours reading from the congressional record to his grandfather and attended his first presidential convention at age 14. He later took his grandfather's last name as his own first name. Later came his first novel, Willawop, published in 1946. But it wasn't until the publication of The City and the Pillar in 1948, one of the first works of American fiction to explicitly examine homosexual subculture, that Mr. Vidal drew national attention. Mr. Vidal once told the Washington Post, "So I'm always called outrageous. What have I ever done that's outrageous?" Well, Mr. Vidal, you haven't run for president. But maybe we shouldn't put any outrageous ideas in your head. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gore Vidal.
I should tell you that I've just come from New Hampshire. I thought about filing, but then it seemed, why? Incidentally, on my name, I was christened Eugene Luther Gore Vidal. Everybody thinks that I later took my grandfather's name, and Hope Ridings Miller sitting over there, I think you were at Marywood that day when the christening party was held. I was 10 years old, and my sister, Mrs. Michael Straight, who's sitting somewhere here, was also being christened. Anyway, that was my name as of then. I'm sorry to tear all of you away from West Palm Beach. I myself find any moment away from the trial a moment wasted, so I mean, I like the O-Bar, but I don't know, somehow Lulu sounds better to me. I mean, I've recreated them all in my head. And there's one called Brewster's that got some mention that sounded nice, you know. And then, of course, as the Soviet Union collapses and our economy crashes, the only question Americans are asking themselves is, can William Kennedy Smith shoot straight, half-cocked? The things we've heard on prime time, my cheeks have been scarlet. It's been outrageous. Outrageous what's been going on. This is the third time in 30 years that I have talked to you at the National Press Club. And before me, my father spoke to you. And before him, my grandfather spoke to you. So this is kind of a family affair for me. I grew up in this city. In my day, the capital of the country was approached by highways. Today, it is surrounded by a beltway. This is perhaps symbolic of our imperial status. My feelings toward the press club are part affectionate and part irritable. Irritable often at the way you are obliged to present what is supposed to be the news, but is more often than not a fictive worldview that the corporate ownership of the country would like us to accept. I have only to remind you of that extraordinary resonant phrase, "the Russians are coming," to recall to you the dangerous and expensive nonsense that we all had to put up with for so very long. I thought I'd do a bit of salvaging here. There's a book coming out, H.L. Mencken's Collected Journalism, to which I've written a foreword. And I seem to remember there was kind of a row here over, it was alleged that Mr. Mencken was an anti-Semite. He wasn't, in spite of his diaries, in which he cannot find a minority that he likes, including the WASPs. And certainly to Mencken's eternal credit, he never once, that I know of, had a good word to say for the majority of his countrymen. If you'd like to know what Mencken had to say on that subject, to put this at rest, his anti-Semitism, on November 27, 1938, in the Baltimore Sun, he wrote, "It is to be hoped that the poor Jews now being robbed and mauled in Germany will not take too seriously the plans of various politicians to rescue them." He then reviews the various schemes. To the British proposal that the Jews be admitted to British Guiana, he writes, "Try to imagine a German Jewish lawyer or insurance man or merchant or schoolmaster in a place where the climate is that of a Turkish bath. Tanganyika he thought marginally better, but still pretty bad. He said at least as good as the worst parts of Mexico. He then suggests that Canada could absorb 100,000 or even 200,000 German Jews with great ease, and they would be useful acquisitions, especially in the western prairie populations, which are dominated today by a low grade of farmers without any adequate counterbalance of a competent middle class." Can you imagine writing that today? The Farmers Anti-Defamation League of Saskatchewan would have your column banned. He then suggests Australia. He said Australia, now almost as exclusive as Sing Sing, which it somewhat resembles in population, could use, political correctness was ever on his lips, could use quite as many Jews as Canada and New Zealand. And then he gets down to business. The American plan for helping the refugees is less openly brutal than the British plan, but almost as insulting to them and even more futile. And Mencken then concludes, this is 1938, there's only one way to help the fugitives, and that is to find places for them in a country which they can really live. Why shouldn't the United States take a couple of 100,000 of them, or even all of them? I don't think that sounds like anti-Semitism to me. The State of the Union, not very good. David Hume, meditating on power, came to the conclusion that as those who govern are few, while those who are governed are many, then logically, the many should dominate the few. But this is not the case. So how do the few control the many? Through opinion, he wrote. How is opinion disseminated? From the pulpit and in the schoolroom. That was the 18th century, of course. Today, opinion is created almost entirely by that unlovely word, media, which in turn is controlled by corporate America, which in turn is more and more being dominated by international cartels. Hence, American opinion is as apt to be created in a Tokyo boardroom as one in New York. The national press, you are loyal dispensers, very often, of opinion, which means that at any moment, certain matters of great importance cannot be brought up on television or in the press because the opinion makers do not want such things discussed. Clarence Thomas's views of the Constitution, to the extent that he has ever had any, were out of bounds, but his exuberant sweet talk to a woman in his office was a great and useful diversion. This sort of calculated diversion from what truly matters is now more the rule than not. Since the military budget cannot be discussed in any detail, ever, the opinion makers and their dispensers prefer to go on and on about sex, abortion, prayer, the flag, matters of no public urgency or even relevancy. But they are emotionally hot issues and irresistible to any government that has a great deal to hide, such as the one that we are currently saddled with. At my last appearance here, I described how in 1950, the American Republic was secretly replaced by the national security state. This was a bipartisan enterprise presided over by Harry Truman. The purpose was to keep the United States on a wartime footing forever because of the perils of communism in general and the Russian military in particular. Truman instituted loyalty oaths, and the FBI was enjoined to go after homegrown communists. For decades, the acronym FBI could very well have stood for Federal Blackmail Institute. The War and Navy departments became the Defense Department, and the CIA was created, a secret police organization that does not submit its actual budget to Congress as the Constitution requires. But the national security state largely ignores the Constitution, and the famous checks and balances have been allowed to come to idle rest. The two great constitutional powers of Congress to declare war and to appropriate money have been surrendered to the executive. In case some of us hadn't got the point, Mr. Bush nicely reminded us last year that we'd already fought a couple of hundred wars without a congressional declaration, and so he means to go right on fighting wars with whatever money he can borrow from abroad. As far as the power of the purse, Congress now invents various Rube Goldberg formulas to limit spending, and these formulas never work. As we watched the White House coach the unqualified Clarence Thomas for a place on the court, it became dramatically clear that the court is now nothing more than a 9-member legal council to the executive, a council of intellectual mediocrities chosen to endorse any decree issued by the imperial executive. The court's dislike of the American people is startlingly open, and the joy with which it chops away at the Bill of Rights is a marvel to behold. As I look about my native city, I have a distinct sense that we are living in a pre-revolutionary time. The race war grows more intense, poverty more severe, the rich richer. The hatred of those inside the fabled Beltway for those outside is now, what else? Creating a true hatred on the part of the many for the few who govern, or appear to do so, since the decision makers and paymasters are beyond our reach in the boardrooms of the world. I like to watch the Sunday Zoo on television when journalists and politicians talk nonsense. No problem is ever addressed, but there's a lot of talk about process, a near meaningless word in these parts. Recently, I watched the director of the budget babble to those distinguished receivers of conventional wisdom, Professors Evans and Novak. What to do about the budget? To my amazement, the defense budget was actually mentioned by Mr. Evans. Apparently, the Brookings Institute thought that a few $100s might be cut. But although the defense budget is the cancer that is killing our body politic, it cannot be dealt with by the media. And the director of the budget, one of my favorite characters on television, was swift to create a diversion. Entitlements, he wrote. He moaned, if only we could get them on the table. He shook his head in despair at the trillions of dollars that we waste on free dentures and profligate unwed mothers. Now, it is wonderfully ironic for anyone to complain about people programs, because wasteful or not, there are not very many of them. But you can't point this out on television because both journalists and politicians are hired by the same people, and back of those people is the corporate wealth of the country. The budget is always faked, and no one ever questions it. The famous entitlements consist largely of disbursements for Social Security, and Social Security contributions are always counted as a part of the federal revenue. But Social Security is a separate trust fund whose income and outgo has nothing to do with the actual budget. Theoretically, on paper, Social Security is a profitable trust fund. Actually, all of our contributions have been transformed into government bonds, so many IOUs that are not going to be redeemed in any foreseeable American future. Yet why, for years now, does the government pretend that Social Security payments are part of its annual revenue? Well, they do so because if you took it out of the budget, you would then see that perhaps 90% of the federal income over the years has been spent on war-related matters or on servicing the debt on money borrowed for war. Incidentally, a statistic I have not yet checked, but I just heard that for the first time in 1990, the cost of servicing the debt was equal to the amount of money appropriated for the Pentagon. Although there has been no war declared since 1941, at regular intervals, the National Security Council can be relied upon to create a diversionary light show in Iraq or an illegal invasion of a weak country like Panama. In any case, if you don't count Social Security payments as revenue, Bush is currently spending $1.2 trillion a year while taking in only $800 billion from our taxes. So the real deficit is about $450 billion. That makes the total national debt close to $4 trillion. In 1980, it was a mere $1 trillion. It is true that the Pentagon itself gets less money these days than it used to, but foreign aid, nuclear energy, debt service, payments to the true victims of our wars, our veterans, still account for most of federal expenditures and deficits. I seem to recall that 3 years ago, opinion makers here in town were mildly interested in overruns at the Defense Department. There was to be an investigation, you remember, and John Tower was going to be the point man. He'd be in place to make sure that nothing untoward was discovered. But Cheney got the job instead, and there have been no meaningful investigations on his watch. I love the phrases around here, on my watch. Do you notice how they keep saying, this president? No, this president. I thought at first it was Nancy Reagan, of course, kept talking about this president. They all do. In my day, it was the president. The savings and loan bailout is probably not possible, as the Japanese and the Germans are no longer willing to finance so feckless and corrupt a political and economic system as ours. The entire cost of World War II in current dollars, and that includes service-connected veteran benefits, was about $460 billion. The cost of bailing out the S&Ls will be at least $500 billion, or $40 billion more than the entire cost of World War II. We have been robbed, all of us. It is a commonplace that half of those qualified to vote for president don't vote. Also, that half the adult population never reads a newspaper. No bad thing all in all. Assuming that they could read a newspaper, which is moot, as the public schools now rank last in the first world, while our prison population, symmetrically, is the highest, surpassing at last South Africa and the Soviet Union, or whatever they call it today. We have also passed Iraq and Iran as the #1 executor of minors. Because the ownership of the country has never liked the idea of political parties, we have only one, divided into two sections, the Democrats and the Republicans. Every 4 years, the naive are encouraged to believe that if we can elect a really nice man or woman president, everything's going to be all right. But it won't be. Any individual who is able to raise $25 million to be considered presidential is not going to be much use to the people at large. He will represent oil or aerospace or banking or cut the capital gains tax. The only thing Bush has had to say for 3 years, well, that was the price of getting the money to be elected. Certainly such a candidate will never represent the people of the country, and they know it. Hence the sense of despair throughout the land as incomes fall and businesses fail, and there is no redress. Before the national security state, for those of you my age, was invented, we had something called representative government. It didn't work awfully well, but at least there was some sense that from time to time something might be done about, let's say, the Depression, the sort of thing that now cannot be done by a system where all the public revenues are earmarked for weaponry and war and secret police forces, and now the servicing of some $3 to $4 trillion worth of debt. But enough of gloom and doom and cheerlessness. We are lucky in so troubled a time that we can take pride in the fact that the United States has more lawyers than the rest of the world put together. There are 756,000, to be precise, of whom Mr. Bush assured us that Clarence Thomas was the best, and I think he was right. What to do? When we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government which we might expect in a country without government, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. The palaces of kings are built upon the bowers of paradise. Naturally, you will all recognize those words from Common Sense by Thomas Paine. How do we get rid of this bad government? There is certainly no road back to Eden in any society. And even if we could return, our own Eden was a most mixed affair, based as it was on the enslavement of Africans and the slaughter or deportation of an indigenous population. But until 1950 and our ramshackle world empire, we were improving ourselves. And the generality took part in government while opinion was not so cynically and totally manipulated as now. Since we cannot pay for the empire any longer, we shall soon be coming home. But to what? Our inalienable rights are being systematically alienated. Never has an American government been so busy interfering in the private lives of its citizens, subjecting them to mandatory blood, urine, lie detector tests. Yet the famous war on drugs has nothing at all to do with drugs. It is part of an all-out war on the American people by a government interested only in control. As this grows more evident, I suspect that we shall begin to see an organized resistance to so tyrannous a state. If we had political parties, there might be some control over the executive with its numerous secret police, but we have no political parties. We have no politics, only mindless, issueless elections. I see only one peaceful way out of this corpse of a republic and this literally bankrupt national security state. I draw your attention to Article 5 of the Constitution, this Constitution that our rulers worship but seldom heed. Article 5 describes two methods whereby the Constitution may be amended or otherwise altered. One way, and so far the only way ever taken, is by a vote of 2/3 of both houses of Congress. The amendment is then sent for ratification by the state legislatures. The second procedure is very interesting indeed. In fact, you might almost call it democratic. 2/3 of the state legislatures can request a constitutional convention, which Congress must then convene. Unlike us, the founders did not worship their handiwork. Many thought the original Constitution was bound to fail. Thomas Jefferson wanted to hold a constitutional convention every 30 years, once a generation, because, as he said, you cannot expect a man to wear a boy's jacket. As it turned out, the jacket has been so reshaped over the last 2 centuries that it is now something of a straitjacket for the people at large, and satisfying to no one except those who gain election and profits from our most peculiar system. As you know, in recent years, there have been several movements to convene a constitutional convention. These have been the work of single interest groups, usually on the far right. One movement wants to forbid abortion to every woman. Another wants a balanced budget embedded in the Constitution. What is interesting is that in the 1970s and 80s, 32 state legislatures voted in favor of a convention. Many of them cautiously noted that no subject other than, let's say, a balanced budget could be discussed. In 1967, Senator Sam Ervin was so intrigued by Article 5 that he thoroughly researched the subject and he explained the mechanics in Senate Bill 2307. He took the position that as we, the people, are the true de jure sovereign, we, the people, cannot be held to any single issue once we convene our convention. If we so choose, the entire Constitution could be rewritten. At this point, I part company with my friends of the ACLU, who for once are more pessimistic about our people than I. Oh, the first thing they will get rid of is the Bill of Rights, the liberals moan. To which my answer is, first, I don't think the people are suicidal. And second, what is the difference between losing those rights at an open convention rather than by gradually losing them behind the closed doors of the current Supreme Court? It is true that we are a less homogeneous and less educated people than were the 3 million original inhabitants of the 13 colonies. But I cannot believe that we are so lacking in scholars and in those devoted to the spirit of the original Constitution, and perhaps more important, the Declaration of Independence, that we will do away with our liberties while giving even greater power to the executive to fight wars that only harm us in the end. The people at large have been kept ignorant by bad schools and by the dispensers of false opinion. That is true. That is a problem. But ignorance is not stupidity. And self-interest, as both Hamilton and Madison agreed, is a great motor to the state properly checked and balanced. Of course, the manipulators will be busy at such a convention. The creative minds that gave us the Willie Horton ad will opt for some sort of apple pie fascism. But there are other voices in the land. Finally, there is a great danger facing us all, and that is the mounting fury of those who have been deprived too long of decent lives. And I promise you they will not be apathetic forever. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Rather than be unready for anarchy, I submit that we must sit down and in an orderly way rethink our entire government as well as our place in the world. The founders' last gift to us is the machinery to set things right. Article 5. Let us use it.
You hate everything about the status quo. What would you do to fix it?
I thought I just said what I would do to fix it. I don't say I hate everything about the status quo, but I think we're in great trouble. And I think I've answered that by invoking Article 5. It can be done, and the point is the status quo will not allow it to be done. I'm perfectly practical about that. It suits nobody. After all, if you got into office under this system, you certainly don't want the system changed, do you? But what I see down the road is real violence and the deterioration of the society. What is happening in Yugoslavia, what is happening in the Soviet Union can certainly happen here. People are broke. There is no money. The banks fail. What I'm saying is there is one sort of legal way. There's one way to, okay, we will hear you. We will listen to you. We will actually give you representative government. That's my solution.
Has America lost the will to be socially conscious, or is it simply a matter of waiting for the proper leader to articulate the need for such consciousness?
I'm not much of a believer in the leader makes all the difference. You know, I was around here when Franklin Roosevelt came in, and he was lucky, the country was lucky, we were richer, we were stronger then than we are now, basically, and we almost got out of the Depression. However, it was the Second World War that really got us out of it. I don't think a leader makes the slightest bit of difference. What's wrong is systemic. When a system is all wrong, what difference does it make whom you hire for president? I mean, the banks that put Mr. Bush in and the oil companies, they told him to do one thing, lower the capital gains. And that's the only thing he knows. He just keeps going on about that. Change the system, not the man.
Do the people who voted for Reagan twice and Bush have a right to complain about the economy today?
The Germans call that Schadenfreude, taking joy in the pain of others. Well, they deserve it, yes, I must say. I am disagreeable enough if they voted for those three elections. But remember that half the people don't vote at all, and they're not apathetic. They know it's pointless. I haven't voted for president since 1964, when I voted for Lyndon Johnson, the peace candidate. I have never voted since. I will never be had again. I am not alone. So when they say, oh, Reagan was so popular, well, he wasn't. Every one of his policies, if you ask the people about them, they didn't like them. And as it was, one out of four voted for him. 1 out of 4 voted for the other guy. And half weren't there at all. So, 25% of the country is hardly a mandate. Well.
If you were president, as you might have been, how would you solve the economic problems of this country? Would you cut foreign imports drastically?
No, I wouldn't cut foreign imports. You put on the table, as Mr. Darman said the other Sunday, you put on the table the Pentagon budget. I noticed that SDI got through again $90 billion, and foreign aid. The first presidential candidate who gets up and says, I'm going to stop all foreign aid, will be an enormous response from the folks out there. There's enough money at home, and then we're giving money to other countries. I would certainly, why not? I mean, why not make a conscious effort to get Boeing and Lockheed and Northrop, who by and large control the delegation of my state of California, to Congress. They finance most of them. Why not get them to shift over to mass transit? I mean, if you make a bomber that doesn't fly, presumably, like the B-1, presumably you can make a train, which we hope will go. But why not transfer over? Use that money for things that will repair the infrastructure of the country.
How much damage will the David Duke candidacy do to our country?
No man who has had a chin implant can be all bad. That takes guts, I mean, there's a lot of plastic surgery going on in the higher ranks of politics, but a chin implant is a sign of great seriousness. I mean, don't turn your back on a chin like that, if I'm not mixing metaphors. Well, he will certainly, since Bush got elected as a racist candidate the last time, the Willie Horton ads, and he's forever sending out anti-black messages, which is the way he keeps his peculiar coalition together. Duke will get him out in the open. Oh, I'm told that Patrick Buchanan is going to declare today. So that was the word I heard this morning. All I can say is, the last time we had a President Buchanan, we had the Civil War.
Speaking of Mr. Buchanan, this questioner says, a few years ago you were in deep controversy with neoconservatives, a long line similar to Pat Buchanan's ongoing feud with the same group. Do you now continue to hold these views, and do you see any intellectual kinship between yourself and Mr. Buchanan?
Well, I hope not, but you can't tell. I mean, if William Buckley comes out for legalizing all drugs, as I have done, even people on the wrong side do the right thing occasionally. My wars with the neoconservatives are at the moment at idle rest, but they may start again. I dared to criticize Israel, which of course cannot be done. And if it's a sharp criticism, you're attacked as an anti-Semite. which is like being called a cannibal. You know, how do you prove you're not really a cannibal? You say, well, I never ate any. That doesn't mean you don't want to eat somebody. Well, no, I mean, and a great many people have been smeared by these radical neoconservatives in the interest of their spiritual homeland, and I think it's been a great mischief, and I wish they would cut it out. It's one of the reasons I quoted H.L. Mencken. At least I got him off the hook.
Given your theory of corporate fascism, how do you explain Bush's willingness last fall to increase taxes on the wealthy and on corporations?
What Mr. Bush does on taxes is just a light show. I mean, it makes no sense at all. He does something different every day. I'll give you a meaningful, we're talking about the economy again. 30 years ago, something like 48% of federal revenues came from income tax, from individuals. And about the same amount, 46-7%, came from corporations. We are still paying 47-48%. Corporations are now paying 10%. That is what has happened in the last 30 years. Corporations pay no tax. I think they should be taxed, but every time that's brought up, you're accused of being communist. So, but now that communism is over, maybe we can tax corporations, because if we don't, there's no revenue.
If this is a pre-revolutionary era, what form will the revolution take if it comes?
The interesting thing about revolutions is nobody ever knows what it's going to take. I mean, what form it will take. I think we see a lot of it right now. The fact that the inner cities are, if not rioting, are dangerous for the people who live there, dangerous for visitors. One of the few interesting pieces I've ever come across in the New York Times, my unfavorite newspaper, but they had a very good piece in the magazine section on how 20% of the population, 1/5 of the people, had absolutely split from the rest of the country, and those are the rich, living behind guards with TV monitors, special security. That's 1/5 of a nation has just removed itself from the problems of the 4/5. That's very dangerous and very tempting to people who have nothing. I mean, I walked the other day from Willard's Hotel to the Capitol, and aside from what now looks like a Disneyland federal theme park, not the Washington of my day, but anyway, walking along, it was like bombed out East Berlin. And I thought, this is the capital of a world empire? I mean, you don't see a city in this shape anywhere in Europe. And I have a house south of Naples. Naples isn't this bad. Don't think they won't get restive. They will. What form it will take, I don't want to think.
What changes would your new Constitution include?
Well, I would certainly put the executive back in his box, and perhaps something more like a parliamentary system where you might have an ornamental president with some powers, and then you would have a chief of a party, whoever gets a majority. In Congress would then be a de facto like a prime minister. I think that might be useful. He could then be questioned. I mean, you know, there's a whole generation that has grown up thinking that presidents are always standing below helicopters, saying, "What was that? What was that?"
You have written historical novels that touched on just about every era of American history. What are you planning to examine next?
Well, I think I've done 6 of these, and I think now I will look back. I have lived through 2/3 of the 20th century, and I've lived through 1/3 of the life of the American Republic, and I was brought up by my grandfather, who was born in 1870, so between the two of us, that's about half the history. So I thought I would look back on it from the present day as myself, over the country as I've seen it, and perhaps have some fictional characters. And then I want to zero in on 45 to 50, which we thought was the golden age. It was all the arts were going. For once we were not at war. The Depression was over. But the irony was that the national security state was being founded, and we didn't know about it. In fact, the actual decree, National Security Council, I think it's number 68, which gives the blueprint for it, did not become public knowledge until 1971 under the Freedom of Information Act. So I'd like to tell how on the one hand we were dancing on the deck, and down below in the engine room something awful was happening.
Will you do a volume on the Reagan-Bush era?
I leave that to the great talents of a historian far greater than I, Kitty Kelly.
This questioner would like to know, has Kitty Kelly ever tried to write your life?
I don't think I'd be interesting to Kitty Kelly, but I've met her a couple of times, and I occur in at least one of her books, and every reference to me is almost right. But she never bothers to pick up a phone, you know, to check it, so it's always just a little bit wrong. But she's great.
Whom do you enjoy reading?
Well, I like Bush's State of the Unions. You know, there isn't much comic writing since S.J. Perlman died, and his press conferences are funnier, but the State of the Union, 1,000 Points of Light, that was the previous administration, but they're all kind of, those things are fun. My favorite writer of my lifetime has been Italo Calvino. I highly recommend him to you.
How is the reader of novelized biography to distinguish between fact and speculation? Shouldn't the difference be made clear?
Well, that's a very good point. I was just up at Dartmouth for a week, and I sat in with an American history class. They'd all been assigned my book, Lincoln, so they've written pieces about it, about 70 of them. And they asked me if I read historical novels. I said, no, I never do. I read history. And they said, well, why don't you? I said, for the same reason that most people don't much care for them, because what's true and what isn't? If you don't, you know, is he making it up or did this really happen? And one girl there said something quite interesting. She said, I loved Burr, whatever it was, 1876, I guess, but then I get to the end of it and I find out that President Martin Van Buren is the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. And I felt the whole thing just went out the window because I said, well, he probably was. And she said, well, what do you base it on? I said, well, John Quincy Adams, well-known gossip of the period, wrote in his diary that he was in the Senate, and Senator Van Buren from New York came to take his oath of office, and he said, Aaron Burr's natural son, looking like a fair version of his dreadful father, has arrived here in Washington. I think, though, I got an idea at Dartmouth. I think I'm going to get some graduate students to go through and do footnotes. So show I'm not making it up.
How can you be so sure that our so-called corporate overlords would not manipulate a constitutional convention convened through the state legislatures?
Well, I'm not sure at all. The state of California is full of referenda that are forever being twisted around. Do you not want, you know, non-smoking smoking, you know? I mean, by the time by the time the cigarette companies have finished with it, you know, and Jesse Helms has done the final polish to it, you can't tell. Of course they will be busy, but there'll be a lot of other people busy too. I mean, in every Eden there is a serpent, but kill it.
The British government is currently investigating the Maxwell companies for precisely the same asset-shifting card tricks the President employs each year in his budget message. Is the U.S. going to go overboard too?
I wish I'd said that, but then I will. But to another audience.
There are those who believe the goal of the present administration is to transform the republic into an oligarchy. Do you think this is so? If so, will it succeed?
I don't think this government has any real plans about anything except, you know, day-to-day survival. The country has always been an oligarchy and probably always will be. That is the nature of politics. When they were cooking up the Constitution at Philadelphia, Madison addressed himself to that because somebody brought up, well, what happens, you know, when there are 100 million people in the country, which means you would have several hundred people in the House of Representatives. It's too big, it's too unwieldy. How would you get any work done? And Madison said, it is an eternal law. It is an iron law of oligarchy, that in every society only a few maneuver it and manipulate it. So you can count on that for good or ill.
Do you share the suspicion that investigations into the October surprise and other matters will of necessity lead nowhere because of careful handling so as not to lead to impeachments?
I don't think we'll ever see an impeachment again, since it is now, I think, somewhere written into the Constitution that no one is accountable for anything. So that's all out. I thought Reagan probably should have been, for a number of reasons, but I think they probably got the October surprise pretty well handled, and I don't think anybody will be nailed. But if they do, what are you going to do? There is no law, really. Everybody seems to be outside of it. Or the new thing now, my friend Barrett Prettyman will instruct me later in it, but the plea bargain. If you committed a crime with 4 others, they torture one of the 4, and then he submits, he speaks against you, and you go to prison, he stays out. That seems to be the new way of doing it. So I rather suspect that for the October surprise, somebody will be sacrificed. Personally, I believe in it. I do believe that in order to get elected, that gang would do anything, but so would the other side.
Since you have come out for legalizing drugs, what do you suggest we do to break through and accomplish this?
Well, legalize means just what I say, legalize. Drugs sold at cost, I think heroin would be about 5 cents. You certainly would money on instruction, just as we don't try not to sell bottles of vodka to 9-year-olds. You wouldn't sell heroin to them. The important thing is to remove the profit motive. Once there's no profit in flogging drugs with the young or with anybody, then crime is out of it. That eliminates not only mafia, big crime, but it also eliminates the guy who knocks the old lady on the head in order to get money for a fix. Just legalize it. I've never seen a country like, Europe just shakes its head with wonder at us. Now, we have laws against everything. I mean, we go into private behavior in a way that is undreamed of in the rest of the first world. They have some laws against drugs. By and large, it's the Drug Enforcement Agency, my favorite name. What does it mean, as usual? Drug enforcement, they enforce you to take drugs is what it means, so that they can then play cops and robbers and get big appropriations. They're going around Europe now making people change their laws and do this and do that to conform to our idiocies. Drugs have been around forever. Some people will always get hooked. Some people will die of it, and, well, that's their choice. Same with alcohol, same with cigarettes. What on earth is this fuss about? Where's the money to fight this war on drugs? And I love the bellicose language, wars and czars. It's nuts.
Do you honestly believe that Larry Tisch, Kay Graham, or John Curley, or their boards of directors, have any influence whatsoever on what stories appear in the news or how they are presented?
It doesn't work like that. Yes, of course they do have enormous influence if they want to use it. What happens is when you have a ruling establishment, you have your job as managing editor because you will think the same way the publisher does, who in turn will think the same way the advertisers or whoever is the ownership that's involved. You're in place, and you know what to do. You don't have to be told what to do. So the head of the New York Times, President of the United States, head of CBS, will all have pretty much the same response to anything that comes up. That's why we have the prep schools, to one of which I went. These are training places, Exeter and Andover, that was for the boys of good family without money who would have to hustle, like George Bush and me. The ones who had money would go to Groton and St. Mark's, and they would be given hobbies so that they wouldn't grow up to be wastrels. But those schools condition you to think in a certain fashion. So my friend Kay does not have to ring up anybody unless it's a big policy decision of some kind, like which nullity to support for president. They're there because they think alike, and that is what a ruling class is.
Is there anyone now running for president you could support, or at least in your mind, is there someone who would do the least harm?
Oh, how can you tell? I mean, there's no way of getting to know them. And since one of the proposals I've been making for 30 years, you can see how well I've done with it, was to make it impossible to give money to candidates, by and large, only small amounts, and then to provide them with free time on television and on radio and in the press. This would mean, let's say in a presidential campaign, that you couldn't buy those 30-second spots. That would be out. What you would have then is the candidates would be grilled by journalists, by their mother-in-law, whoever. You really get to see them as they are, instead of as these sort of, well, cosmetic ads is really, in a sense, what they are. You would then know, at least, you'd have an idea, can the guy think, what's he thinking about, what's in his head? Now I don't know any of them, you don't know any of them, we will never know any of them, unless you're a personal friend.
For many years you have lived in Italy, a country of political cynics. Is that why you feel at home there?
There's a lot to be said for Italian cynicism, but actually I don't live in, I live in Los Angeles too, so you could argue I don't live at all in the United States, but I have a lovely quote here which I didn't use. It's from Giolitti, who was quite a good cynical statesman. And he said, "There is a fatal law that makes every reactionary government seek a diversion abroad." That's Italian cynicism.
Before asking the last question, I'd like to thank you so much for being here. We have a certificate of appreciation and a National Press Club mug.
I got a medallion last time.
The questioner wants to know, when are you taking over your own network talk show?
Well, I'm rather kept off the networks for about 20 years because I don't know why, I don't seem politically correct. I thought everything I say is so reasonable, but they don't seem to want to hear it. But I'm having lunch with Peter Jennings tomorrow, and he said ABC wants to ask you a question, so you might be seeing me soon. Well, we had to hustle.